create as little drag as possible, swimmers need to move through the water as smoothly and as straight as possible. If they're bouncing up and down when they swim, they're not going to be accomplishing that objective, and they're going to be creating a lot more resistance. While there's necessarily going to be up and down motion in breaststroke and butterfly, there shouldn't be in backstroke and freestyle because swimmers are rotating rather than undulating. The more that they can swim straight, avoid bouncing, the less resistance they're going to create and the more speed they're going to create. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. Fast freestyle, fast backstroke is all about minimizing resistance by swimming as straight through the water as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of swimmers tend to bounce up and down when they swim, and that's creating a lot more resistance as they move through the water. The more that they can learn to swim level in the water and maintain a stable position in the water, the more effective they're going to be when they swim. Let's take a look at some elite athletes that do an amazing job of staying level and straight in the water, and we'll talk a little bit about what might be causing swimmers to bounce up and down. So this is a 50 freestyle, and what we're going to pay attention to is not just his head position, but how his head position doesn't move up and down even at really, really high speeds. And that's going to be absolutely critical because that's going to further minimize the amount of bouncing that happens and the amount of resistance that's created as a result. And so if you watch, his head is absolutely rock solid. The goggles aren't moving up and down. You can't see the head move up and down. And as a result, the body's not moving up and down. And so that's going to mean less resistance. The more that swimmers can knife through just like that, the faster they're going to be able to go because of less resistance. Less resistance means more speed. And so if we watch here, the opportunities to start bouncing mostly happen upon entry. And so if the swimmer is going to crash down through the entry, that's going to press down on the water. That's going to push the body up. And not only does that happen upon entry, but during the first part of the pull, so he's entering the water, he's setting up the stroke, and now he's applying pressure. If swimmers apply pressure straight down, in through the catch, that's going to press them up out of the water as well. And since the hands are alternating back and forth between one side and the other, that's going to cause a bouncing action where they press, then they fall back down, they press with the other arm, they fall back down, they press with the other arm, they fall back down. And so you can see here, he's entering pretty clean. You can see the whole hand there, that's pretty clean. And then also, he's patient, and then he starts applying pressure at that point. And by the time he applies pressure, he's already got his arm more or less facing backwards, and so he's not just pressing through the front of it, which is going to push his body up in the air, and what goes up comes back down, and now we've got a lot of resistance and we've got problems. So by maintaining a really good hand entry and a good patient setup of the stroke, not applying pressure right away, he's able to keep that head position exactly where it needs to be, and he's not creating extra resistance by bouncing up and down. So we'll take a look at the same thing from a different angle, a different swimmer. And what you can see is that there's really stable position with the head, and that's going to allow him to maintain a lower amount of resistance. And so again, clean entries. He's not pressing through the front of the stroke. You can see the hand enters there, and then he doesn't really accelerate until right about there, and the hand is more or less facing backwards by that point, and that allows him to create a lot more propulsion, but also he's not pressing through the front of the stroke and lifting his body. Now, the faster swimmers want to go, the more difficult this is to make it happen because the stroke rates get higher. One, you're going to have a more ballistic entry, and two, it's harder to get that timing down when the arm speed, the tempo is really high. It's hard to be patient in the front of the stroke and apply pressure at the right time. And so it becomes very difficult to do it. And that's one reason you tend to see bouncing happening more in sprinting because it's a lot harder to manage these skills at really high stroke rates. And because the arms are moving faster, not only do they have less time to get it right, there's a lot more energy entering the water and it's harder to manage that. So the more that swimmers can be patient in the front of the stroke at really high stroke rates and are clean, then they're not going to be bouncing as much when they move through the water. Again, it becomes very difficult to do at really high speeds. And so even with this swimmer, there's a slight amount of up and down motion, but the goal is to keep it as low as possible. And the more that swimmers can be effective with the entries and effective with the setup of the stroke, the more they're going to be able to make that happen. Now the same thing is going to be happening here in backstroke. And so the hands are going to be slapping into the water, and because it's a straight arm recovery, the arm recovery tends to be a lot more ballistic, and it's even more challenging to enter really cleanly, but these backstrokers are doing a really good job of it. So if you watch, the head position stays really stable. The head is staying right in the same place. The cap's not moving around. You can see the logos on the side of the cap. They're not moving around much. They're certainly not going up and down. There's maybe a little bit of head turn, but that's not necessarily a problem. And they're moving at high stroke rates. This is a 100-meter race, and they're getting after it, but they're still being really stable with the head because they're being really clean with the entries. And so while backstrokers aren't necessarily pressing through the front of the stroke like they might in freestyle, they do have a more ballistic entry with the arm recoveries, and so they have to manage that as well. And so as you can see, as you look across the pool here, the head positions are really stable. There's not much bouncing, and I'm sure you've seen that when you've seen your swimmers. You've seen them really bounce up and down, and that's a large part because of what's happening with the entry, what's happening with the beginning of the stroke. And so that the more that swimmers can find a way to keep the tempo really high, but enter cleanly, not press through the beginning of the stroke, they're going to be able to keep the head more stable. They're not going to be bouncing up and down. And every time they do that, they're just creating more resistance, which is creating more drag, which means less speed. So we'll take a look at the same thing with a 50 backstroke. And you can see, even at really high speeds, these swimmers are being really stable with the head position. They're not bouncing up and down, and they are definitely entering the water with really high rates. And so it's really important to note that they're doing so by entering cleanly. You can see that swimmer's not taking a whole lot of bubbles down with him. He's entering real clean, and then he's setting up the stroke, and then he's letting it rip. And there's going to be some cavitation. There's going to be some turbulence after he starts applying pressure, but that's not necessarily the bubbles that he's bringing down with him. So really clean entries in backstroke allow for really stable head position. That means less resistance, and if they're entering cleanly, they're more likely to get an effective setup of the stroke as well. And while you're not likely to see the same amount of bouncing in butterfly, especially as there's going to be a natural undulation of the stroke as well, if swimmers are crashing through the front of the stroke, if they are pressing through the front of the stroke, that's going to lift the body a little bit unnecessarily. And considering that butterflyers are trying to press the chest to get the hips up in the front of the stroke, if they're slamming through the entry, they're pressing down on the entry, they're pressing down on the setup of the stroke during the catch, that's going to prevent them from getting in position. And so if you have swimmers that are really struggling to get the hips up, you're not necessarily going to see the same bouncing again like you do in freestyle and backstroke. However, you have the same issue with pressing through the front. It's going to prevent them from getting and maintaining an effective body position. It's going to prevent them from getting the hips up. And so you have the same issue there. So the more swimmers can learn to enter cleanly, and just as importantly, be patient with the setup of their stroke, the less resistance they're going to create by disrupting body position, by elevating the upper body when they press down through the front of the stroke. And the more resistance they create, the less speed they're going to create. If you want to learn more about the importance of clean hand entries in terms of keeping resistance low, check out the video below.